Preface of the Author, Volume 1, Part 2. It is not my intention to detain the reader by expatiating on the variety or the importance of the subject which I have undertaken to treat, since the merit of the choice would serve to render the weakness of the execution still more apparent and still less excusable. But as I have presumed to lay before the public a first volume only of the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it will perhaps be expected that I should explain in a few words the nature and limits of my general plan. The memorable series of revolutions, which in the course of about 13 centuries gradually undermined and at length destroyed the solid fabric of human greatness, may, with some propriety, be divided into the three following periods. 1. The first of these periods may be traced from the age of Trajan and the Antonines, when the Roman monarchy, having attained its full strength and maturity, began to verge towards its decline, and will extend to the subversion of the Western Empire by the barbarians of Germany and Scythia, the rude ancestors of the most polished nations of modern Europe. This extraordinary revolution, which subjected Rome to the power of a Gothic conqueror, was completed about the beginning of the 6th century. 2. The second period of the decline and fall of Rome may be supposed to commence with the reign of Justinian, who by his laws as well as by his victories restored a transient splendor to the Eastern Empire. It will comprehend the invasion of Italy by the Lombards, the conquest of the Asiatic and African provinces by the Arabs, who embraced the religion of Mahomet, the revolt of the Roman people against the feeble princes of Constantinople, and the elevation of Charlemagne, who in the year 800 established the Second or German Empire of the West. 3. The last and longest of these periods includes about 6 centuries and a half, from the revival of the Western Empire till the taking of Constantinople by the Turks and the extinction of a degenerate race of princes who continued to assume the titles of Caesar and Augustus after their dominions were contracted to the limits of a single city, in which the language as well as manners of the ancient Romans had been long since forgotten. The writer who should undertake to relate the events of this period would find himself obliged to enter into the general history of the Crusades, as far as they contributed to the ruin of the Greek Empire, and he would scarcely be able to restrain his curiosity from making some inquiry into the state of the city of Rome during the darkness and confusion of the Middle Ages. As I have ventured, perhaps too hastily, to commit to the press a work which in every sense of the word deserves the epithet of imperfect, I consider myself as contracting an engagement to finish, most probably in a second volume, the first of these memorable periods, and to deliver to the public the complete history of the decline and fall of Rome, from the age of the Antonines to the subversion of the Western Empire. With regard to the subsequent periods, though I may entertain some hopes, I dare not presume to give any assurances. The execution of the extensive plan which I have described would connect the ancient and modern history of the world, but it would require many years of health, of leisure, and of perseverance. Bentin Seek and Treat, February 1, 1776. P.S. The entire history which is now published of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the West abundantly discharges my engagements with the public. Perhaps their favorable opinion may encourage me to prosecute a work which, however laborious it may seem, is the most agreeable occupation of my leisure hours. Bentin Screet, March 1, 1781. An author easily persuades himself that the public opinion is still favorable to his labors, and I have now embraced the serious resolution of proceeding to the last period of my original design and of the Roman Empire, the taking of Constantinople by the Turks in the year 1453. The most patient reader, who computes that 3 ponderous volumes have been already employed on the events of 4 centuries, may, perhaps, be alarmed at the long prospect of 900 years. But it is not my intention to expatiate with the same minuteness on the whole series of the Byzantine history. At our entrance into this period, the reign of Justinian and the conquests of the Mahometans will deserve and detain our attention, and the last age of Constantinople, the Crusades and the Turks, is connected with the revolutions of modern Europe. From the 7th to the 11th century, the obscure interval will be supplied by a concise narrative of such facts as may still appear either interesting or important. Bentinseek Street, Marcher, 1st 1, 1782. Preface to the first volume. Diligence and accuracy are the only merits which an historical writer may ascribe to himself, if any merit, indeed, can be assumed from the performance of an indispensable duty. I may therefore be allowed to say that I have carefully examined all the original materials that could illustrate the subject which I had undertaken to treat. Should I ever complete the extensive design which has been sketched out in the preface, I might perhaps conclude it with a critical account of the authors consulted during the progress of the whole work, and however such an attempt might incur the censure of ostentation, I am persuaded that it would be susceptible of entertainment as well as information. At present I shall content myself with a single observation. The biographers who, under the reigns of Diocletian and Constantine, composed, or rather compiled, the lives of the emperors, from Hadrian to the sons of Carus, are usually mentioned under the names of Aelius Spartianus, Julius Capitolinus, Aelius, Lampridius, Volcatius Gallicanus, Trebellius Pollio, and Flavius Vopiscus. But there is so much perplexity in the titles of the MSS, and so many disputes have arisen among the critics. C. Fabricius, Biblioth, Latin, L.II. C. 6. Concerning their number, their names, and their respective property, that for the most part I have quoted them without distinction, under the general and well-known title of the Augustan History, Preface, to the 4th volume of the original quarto edition. I now discharge my promise and complete my design of writing the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, both in the West and the East. The whole period extends from the age of Trajan and the Antonines to the taking of Constantinople by Mahomet II, and includes a review of the Crusades and the state of Rome during the Middle Ages. Since the publication of the first volume, 12 years have elapsed, 12 years, according to my wish, of health, of leisure, and of perseverance. I may now congratulate my deliverance from a long and laborious service, and my satisfaction will be pure and perfect if the public favor should be extended to the conclusion of my work. It was my first intention to have collected under one view the numerous authors of every age and language from whom I have derived the materials of this history, and I am still convinced that the apparent ostentation would be more than compensated by real use. If I have renounced this idea, if I have declined an undertaking which had obtained the approbation of a master artist, my excuse may be found in the extreme difficulty of assigning a proper measure to such a catalogue. A naked list of names and editions would not be satisfactory either to myself or my readers. The characters of the principal authors of the Roman and Byzantine history have been occasionally connected with the events which they describe. A more copious and critical inquiry might indeed deserve, but it would demand an elaborate volume which might swell by degrees into a general library of historical writers. For the present, I shall content myself with renewing my serious protestation that I have always endeavored to draw from the fountainhead, that my curiosity, as well as a sense of duty, has always urged me to study the originals, and that, if they have sometimes eluded my search, I have carefully marked the secondary evidence on whose faith a passage or a fact were reduced to depend. I shall soon revisit the banks of the Lake of Lausanne, a country which I have known and loved from my early youth, under a mild government, amidst a beauteous landscape, in a life of leisure and independence, and among a people of easy and elegant manners. I have enjoyed, and may again hope to enjoy, the varied pleasures of retirement and society, but I shall ever glory in the name and character of an Englishman. I am proud of my birth in a free and enlightened country, and the approbation of that country is the best and most honorable reward of my labors. Were I ambitious of any other patron than the public, I would inscribe this work to a statesman who, in a long, a stormy, and at length an unfortunate administration, had many political opponents, almost without a personal enemy, who has retained, in his fall from power, many faithful and disinterested friends, and who, under the pressure of severe infirmity, enjoys the lively vigour of his mind, and the felicity of his incomparable temper. Lord North would permit me to express the feelings of friendship in the language of truth, but even truth and friendship should be silent if he still dispensed the favours of the crown. In a remote solitude, vanity may still whisper in my ear, that my readers, perhaps, may inquire whether, in the conclusion of the present work, I am now taking an everlasting farewell. They shall hear all that I know myself, and all that I could reveal to the most intimate friend. The motives of action or silence are now equally balanced, nor can I pronounce in my most secret thoughts on which side the scale will preponderate. I cannot dissemble that 6 quartos must have tried, and may have exhausted, the indulgence of the public, that, in the repetition of similar attempts, a successful author has much more to lose than he can hope to gain, that I am now descending into the vale of years, and that the most respectable of my countrymen, the men whom I aspire to imitate, have resigned the pen of history about the same period of their lives. Yet I consider that the annals of ancient and modern times may afford many rich and interesting subjects, that I am still possessed of health and leisure, that by the practice of writing some skill and facility must be acquired, and that, in the ardent pursuit of truth and knowledge, I am not conscious of decay. To an active mind, indolence is more painful than labor, and the first months of my liberty will be occupied and amused in the excursions of curiosity and taste. By such temptations, I have been sometimes seduced from the rigid duty even of a pleasing and voluntary task, but my time will now be my own, and in the use or abuse of independence, I shall no longer fear my own reproaches or those of my friends. I am fairly entitled to a year of jubilee. Next summer and the following winter will rapidly pass away, and experience only can determine whether I shall still prefer the freedom and variety of study to the design and composition of a regular work, which animates while it confines the daily application of the author. Caprice and accident may influence my choice, but the dexterity of self-love will contrive to applaud either active industry or philosophic repose. Downing Street, May 1, 1788. P.S. I shall embrace this opportunity of introducing 2 verbal remarks which have not conveniently offered themselves to my notice. 1. As often as I use the definitions of beyond the Alps, the Rhine, the Danube, and Ci, I generally suppose myself at Rome, and afterwards at Constantinople, without observing whether this relative geography may agree with the local, but variable, situation of the reader or the historian. 2. In proper names of foreign, and especially of Oriental origin, it should be always our aim to express, in our English version, a faithful copy of the original. But this rule, which is founded on a just regard to uniformity and truth, must often be relaxed, and the exceptions will be limited or enlarged by the custom of the language and the taste of the interpreter. Our alphabets may be often defective. A harsh sound, an uncouth spelling, might offend the ear or the eye of our countrymen, and some words, notoriously corrupt, are fixed and, as it were, naturalized in the vulgar tongue. The Prophet Muhammad can no longer be stripped of the famous, though improper, appellation of Muhammad. The well-known cities of Aleppo, Damascus, and Cairo would almost be lost in the strange descriptions of Haleb, Damascus, and Al-Kahira. The titles and offices of the Ottoman Empire are fashioned by the practice of 300 years, and we are pleased to blend the 3 Chinese monosyllables Confuzi in the respectable name of Confucius, or even to adopt the Portuguese eruption of Mandarin. But I would vary the use of Zoroaster and Zerdusht, as I drew my information from Greece or Persia, since our connection with India, the genuine Timur, is restored to the throne of Tamerlane. Our most correct writers have retrenched the Allah, the superfluous article from the Quran, and we escape an ambiguous termination by adopting Muslim instead of Musulman in the plural number. In these and in 1,000 examples, the shades of distinction are often minute, and I can feel, where I cannot explain, the motives of my choice. Chapter 1. The Extent of the Empire in the Age of the Antonines. Part 1. Introduction. The extent and military force of the empire in the age of the Antonines. In the 2nd century of the Christian era, the Empire of Rome comprehended the fairest part of the earth and the most civilized portion of mankind. The frontiers of that extensive monarchy were guarded by ancient renown and disciplined valor. The gentle but powerful influence of laws and manners had gradually cemented the union of the provinces. Their peaceful inhabitants enjoyed and abused the advantages of wealth and luxury. The image of a free constitution was preserved with decent reverence. The Roman Senate appeared to possess the sovereign authority and devolved on the emperors all the executive powers of government. During a happy period of more than 80 years, the public administration was conducted by the virtue and abilities of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the 2 Antonines. It is the design of this and of the 2 succeeding chapters to describe the prosperous condition of their empire, and afterwards, from the death of Marcus Antoninus, to deduce the most important circumstances of its decline and fall, a revolution, which will ever be remembered and is still felt by the nations of the earth. The principal conquests of the Romans were achieved under the Republic, and the emperors, for the most part, were satisfied with preserving those dominions which had been acquired by the policy of the Senate, the active emulations of the consuls, and the martial enthusiasm of the people. The 7 first centuries were filled with a rapid succession of triumphs, but it was reserved for Augustus to relinquish the ambitious design of subduing the whole earth and to introduce a spirit of moderation into the public councils. Inclined to peace by his temper and situation, it was easy for him to discover that Rome, in her present exalted situation, had much less to hope than to fear from the chance of arms, and that, in the prosecution of remote wars, the undertaking became every day more difficult, the event more doubtful, and the possession more precarious and less beneficial. The experience of Augustus added weight to these salutary reflections and effectually convinced him that, by the prudent vigor of his counsels, it would be easy to secure every concession which the safety or the dignity of Rome might require from the most formidable barbarians. Instead of exposing his person and his legions to the arrows of the Parthians, he obtained, by an honorable treaty, the restitution of the standards and prisoners which had been taken in the defeat of Crassus. Dion Cassius, L. Liv. p. 736, with the annotations of Riomar, who has collected all that Roman vanity has left upon the subject. The marble of Ancira, on which Augustus recorded his own exploits, asserted that he compelled the Parthians to restore the ensigns of Crassus. His generals, in the early part of his reign, attempted the reduction of Ethiopia and Arabia Felix. They marched near 1,000 miles to the south of the tropic, but the heat of the climate soon repelled the invaders and protected the unwarlike natives of those sequestered regions. The northern countries of Europe scarcely deserved the expense and labor of conquest. The forests and morasses of Germany were filled with a hardy race of barbarians who despised life when it was separated from freedom, and though, on the first attack, they seemed to yield to the weight of the Roman power, they soon, by a signal act of despair, regained their independence and reminded Augustus of the vicissitude of fortune. On the death of that emperor, his testament was publicly read in the Senate. He bequeathed, as a valuable legacy to his successors, the advice of confining the empire within those limits which nature seemed to have placed as its permanent bulwarks and boundaries. On the west, the Atlantic Ocean, the Rhine and Danube; on the north, the Euphrates; on the east, and towards the south, the sandy deserts of Arabia and Africa. Note, it is this city of Merab that the Arabs say was the residence of Belkis, queen of Saba, who desired to see Solomon. A dam by which the waters collected in its neighborhood were kept back, having been swept away. The sudden inundation destroyed this city, of which, nevertheless, vestiges remain. It bordered on a country called Adramaut, where a particular aromatic plant grows. It is for this reason that we reel in the history of the Roman expedition that they were arrived within 3 days' journey of the spice country. Gigi. Compare Molte Brun Geogra. Engci Trans. Volume I. p. 215. The period of this flood has been copiously discussed by Reiske. Program. De Vetusta. Epoca Arabum. Ruptura Cataracta Meravensis. Ad. Johansen, Hist. Yemena p. 282. Bonn, Nye, 1828, and see Gibbon, Note 16, to Chap. L.M. Note 2, according to Strabo. The detailed account of Strabo makes the invaders fail before Marswaba. This cannot be the same place as Mariaba. Ukut observes that Aelius Gallus would not have failed for want of water before Mariaba. See M. Yorba, Dizo's note above. Either, therefore, they were different places, or Strabo is mistaken. Ukut, Geographie de Griechen und Römer, Vol. IP 81. Strabo, indeed, mentions Mariaba distinct from Marswaba. Gibbon has followed Pliny in reckoning Mariaba among the conquests of Gallus. There can be little doubt that he is wrong, as Gallus did not approach the capital of Sabah. Compare the note of the Oxford editor of Strabo. M. Happily for the repose of mankind, the moderate system recommended by the wisdom of Augustus was adopted by the fears and vices of his immediate successors. Engaged in the pursuit of pleasure or in the exercise of tyranny, the first Caesar seldom showed themselves to the armies or to the provinces, nor were they disposed to suffer that those triumphs which their indolence neglected should be usurped by the conduct and valor of their lieutenants. The military fame of a subject was considered as an insolent invasion of the imperial prerogative, and it became the duty, as well as interest, of every Roman general to guard the frontiers entrusted to his care, without aspiring to conquests which might have proved no less fatal to himself than to the vanquished barbarians. The only accession which the Roman Empire received during the first century of the Christian era was the province of Britain. In this single instance, the successors of Caesar and Augustus were persuaded to follow the example of the former rather than the precept of the latter. The proximity of its situation to the coast of Gaul seemed to invite their arms. The pleasing though doubtful intelligence of a pearl fishery attracted their avarice. And as Britain was viewed in the light of a distinct and insulated world, the conquest scarcely formed any exception to the general system of continental measures. After a war of about 40 years, undertaken by the most stupid, maintained by the most dissolute, and terminated by the most timid of all the emperors, the far greater part of the island submitted to the Roman yoke. The various tribes of Britain possessed valor without conduct, and the love of freedom without the spirit of union. They took up arms with savage fierceness. They laid them down, or turned them against each other with wild inconsistency, and while they fought singly, they were successively subdued. Neither the fortitude of Caractacus, nor the despair of Boadicea, nor the fanaticism of the Druids could avert the slavery of their country, or resist the steady progress of the imperial generals who maintained the national glory when the throne was disgraced by the weakest or the most vicious of mankind. At the very time when Domitian, confined to his palace, felt the terrors which he inspired, his legions, under the command of the virtuous Agricola, defeated the collected force of the Caledonians at the foot of the Grampian hills, and his fleets, venturing to explore an unknown and dangerous navigation, displayed the Roman arms round every part of the island. The conquest of Britain was considered as already achieved, and it was the design of Agricola to complete and ensure his success by the easy reduction of Ireland, for which, in his opinion, 1 legion and a few auxiliaries were sufficient. The Western Isle might be improved into a valuable possession, and the Britons would wear their chains with the less reluctance if the prospect and example of freedom were on every side removed from before their eyes. Caesar himself conceals that ignoble motive, but it is mentioned by Suetonius, c. 47. The British pearls proved, however, of little value, on account of their dark and livid color. Tacitus observes with reason in Agricola, c. 12. That it was an inherent defect. Ego facilius crediderim, naturam margaritis deesse quam nobis avaritiam. Tu Shaption Claudius, Nero, and Domitian. A hope is expressed by Pomponius Mela, Liii. CII 6, he wrote under Claudius, that by the success of the Roman arms, the island and its savage inhabitants would soon be better known. It is amusing enough to peruse such passages in the midst of London. See the admirable abridgment given by Tacitus in the Life of Agricola, and copiously, though perhaps not completely, illustrated by our own antiquarians, Camden and Horsley. The Irish writers, jealous of their national honor, are extremely provoked on this occasion, both with Tacitus and with Agricola. But the superior merit of Agricola soon occasioned his removal from the government of Britain, and forever disappointed this rational though extensive scheme of conquest. Before his departure, the prudent general had provided for security as well as for dominion. He had observed that the island is almost divided into two unequal parts by the opposite gulfs, or, as they are now called, the friths of Scotland. Across the narrow interval of about 40 miles he had drawn a line of military stations, which was afterwards fortified, in the reign of Antoninus Pius, by a turf rampart erected on foundations of stone. This wall of Antoninus, at a small distance beyond the modern cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow, was fixed as the limit of the Roman province. The native Caledonians preserved, in the northern extremity of the island, their wild independence, for which they were not less indebted to their poverty than to their valor. Their incursions were frequently repelled and chastised, but their country was never subdued. The masters of the fairest and most wealthy climates of the globe turned with contempt from gloomy hills, assailed by the winter tempest, from lakes concealed in a blue mist, and from cold and lonely heaths, over which the deer of the forest were, chased by a troop of naked barbarians. See Horsley's Britannia Romana, LIC 10. Note: Agricola fortified the line from Dumbarton to Edinburgh, consequently within Scotland. The Emperor Hadrian, during his residence in Britain about the year 21, caused a rampart of earth to be raised between Newcastle and Carlisle. Antoninus Pius, having gained new victories over the Caledonians by the ability of his general Lollius Urbicus, caused a new rampart of earth to be constructed between Edinburgh and Dumbarton. Lastly, Septimius Severus caused a wall of stone to be built parallel to the rampart of Hadrian, and on the same locality, see John Warburton's Valum Romanum, or The History and Antiquities of the Roman Wall. London, 1754, 4to. W. See likewise a good note on the Roman Wall in Lingard's History of England, Volume EP. 40, 4to edit. M.I.M. The poet Buchanan celebrates with elegance and spirit, see his Silva, Vi, the unviolated independence of his native country. But if the single testimony of Richard of Cirencester was sufficient to create a Roman province of Vespasiana to the north of the wall, that independence would be reduced within very narrow limits, Suus, see Appian in Proem, and the uniform imagery of Ossian's poems, which, according to every hypothesis, were composed by a native Caledonian. Such was the state of the Roman frontiers, and such the maxims of imperial policy, from the death of Augustus to the accession of Trajan. That virtuous and active prince had received the education of a soldier, and possessed the talents of a general. The peaceful system of his predecessors was interrupted by scenes of war and conquest, and the legions, after a long interval, beheld a military emperor at their head. The first exploits of Trajan were against the Dacians, the most warlike of men, who dwelt beyond the Danube, and who, during the reign of Domitian, had insulted with impunity the majesty of Rome. To the strength and fierceness of barbarians they added a contempt for life, which was derived from a warm persuasion of the immortality and transmigration of the soul. Decebalus, the Dacian king, approved himself a rival not unworthy of Trajan, nor did he despair of his own and the public fortune, till, by the confession of his enemies, he had exhausted every resource both of valor and policy. This memorable war, with a very short suspension of hostilities, lasted 5 years, and as the emperor could exert without control the whole force of the state, it was terminated by an absolute submission of the barbarians. The new province of Dacia, which formed a second exception to the precept of Augustus, was about 1,300 miles in circumference. Its natural boundaries were the Dniester, the Tis or Tibiscus, the lower Danube, and the Euxine Sea. The vestiges of a military road may still be traced from the banks of the Danube to the neighborhood of Bender, a place famous in modern history and the actual frontier of the Turkish and Russian empires. Trajan was ambitious of fame, and as long as mankind shall continue to bestow more liberal applause on their destroyers than on their benefactors, the thirst of military glory will ever be the vice of the most exalted characters. The praises of Alexander, transmitted by a succession of poets and historians, had kindled a dangerous emulation in the mind of Trajan. Like him, the Roman emperor undertook an expedition against the nations of the East, but he lamented with a sigh that his advanced age scarcely left him any hopes of equaling the renown of the son of Philip. Yet the success of Trajan, however transient, was rapid and specious. The degenerate Parthians, broken by intestine discord, fled before his arms. He descended the river Tigris in triumph, from the mountains of Armenia to the Persian Gulf. He enjoyed the honor of being the first, as he was the last, of the Roman generals who ever navigated that remote sea. His fleets ravaged the coast of Arabia, and Trajan vainly flattered himself that he was approaching towards the confines of India. Every day the astonished Senate received the intelligence of new names and new nations that acknowledged his sway. They were informed that the kings of Bosphorus, Colchos, Iberia, Albania, Osroene, and even the Parthian monarch himself had accepted their diadems from the hands of the emperor, that the independent tribes of the Median and Carduchian hills had implored his protection, and that the rich countries of Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Assyria were reduced into the state of provinces. But the death of Trajan soon clouded the splendid prospect, and it was justly to be dreaded that so many distant nations would throw off the unaccustomed yoke when they were no longer restrained by the powerful hand which had imposed it. Chapter 1. The Extent of the Empire in the Age of the Antonines. Part 2. It was an ancient tradition that when the capital was founded by one of the Roman kings, the god Terminus, who presided over boundaries, and was represented, according to the fashion of that age, by a large stone alone, among all the inferior deities, refused to yield his place to Jupiter himself. A favorable inference was drawn from his obstinacy, which was interpreted by the augurs as a sure presage that the boundaries of the Roman power would never recede. During many ages, the prediction, as it is usual, contributed to its own accomplishment. But though Terminus had resisted the majesty of Jupiter, he submitted to the authority of the Emperor Hadrian. The resignation of all the eastern conquests of Trajan was the first measure of his reign. He restored to the Parthians the election of an independent sovereign, withdrew the Roman garrisons from the provinces of Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Assyria, and, in compliance with the precept of Augustus, once more established the Euphrates as the frontier of the empire. Censure, which arraigns the public actions and the private motives of princes, has ascribed to envy a conduct which might be attributed to the prudence and moderation of Hadrian. The various character of that emperor, capable, by turns, of the meanest and the most generous sentiments, may afford some color to the suspicion. It was, however, scarcely in his power to place the superiority of his predecessor in a more conspicuous light than by thus confessing himself unequal to the task of defending the conquests of Trajan. Saint N. Augustine is highly delighted with the proof of the weakness of Terminus and the vanity of the augurs. See De Civitate Dei, EV 29. Note, the turn of Gibbon's sentence is Augustine's, plus Hadrianum regem hominum, quam regem deorum timuisse videatur. Mies 19. See the Augustine History, p5, Jerome's Chronicle, and all the epitomizers. It is somewhat surprising that this memorable event should be omitted by Dion, or rather by Schivelin. The martial and ambitious spirit of Trajan formed a very singular contrast with the moderation of his successor. The restless activity of Hadrian was not less remarkable when compared with the gentle repose of Antoninus Pius. The life of the former was almost a perpetual journey, and as he possessed the various talents of the soldier, the statesman, and the scholar, he gratified his curiosity in the discharge of his duty. Careless of the difference of seasons and of climates, he marched on foot and bareheaded over the snows of Caledonia and the sultry plains of the Upper Egypt, nor was there a province of the empire which, in the course of his reign, was not honored with the presence of the monarch. But the tranquil life of Antoninus Pius was spent in the bosom of Italy, and during the 23 years that he directed the public administration, the longest journeys of that amiable prince extended no farther than from his palace in Rome to the retirement of his Lanuvian villa, E. Dion LLL6, P. 158 Hist. August P. 58. If all our historians were lost, medals, inscriptions, and other monuments would be sufficient to record the travels of Hadrian. Note: the journeys of Hadrian are traced in a note on Solvet's translation of Hegewisch, Essai sur l'époque de l'histoire romaine, la plus heureuse pour Jean Romain, Paris 1834 p. 23 m. Notwithstanding this difference in their personal conduct, the general system of Augustus was equally adopted and uniformly pursued by Hadrian and by the two Antonines. They persisted in the design of maintaining the dignity of the empire without attempting to enlarge its limits. By every honorable expedient they invited the friendship of the barbarians and endeavored to convince mankind that the Roman power, raised above the temptation of conquest, was actuated only by the love of order and justice. During a long period of 43 years, their virtuous labors were crowned with success. And if we accept a few slight hostilities that served to exercise the legions of the frontier, the reigns of Hadrian and Antoninus Pius offer the fair prospect of universal peace. The Roman name was revered among the most remote nations of the earth. The fiercest barbarians frequently submitted their differences to the arbitration of the emperor, and we are informed by a contemporary historian that he had seen ambassadors who were refused the honor which they came to solicit of being admitted into the rank of subjects. 28. We must, however, remember that in the time of Hadrian, a rebellion of the Jews raged with religious fury, though only in a single province. Pausanias LLI CL 43 mentions two necessary and successful wars conducted by the generals of Pius, first against the wandering Moors who were driven into the solitudes of Atlas, 2dd, against the Brigantes of Britain who had invaded the Roman province. Both these wars, with several other hostilities, are mentioned in the Augustan history, pp. 19. The terror of the Roman arms added weight and dignity to the moderation of the emperors. They preserved peace by a constant preparation for war, and while justice regulated their conduct, they announced to the nations on their confines that they were as little disposed to endure as to offer an injury. The military strength, which it had been sufficient for Hadrian and the elder Antoninus to display, was exerted against the Parthians and the Germans by the Emperor Marcus. The hostilities of the barbarians provoked the resentment of that philosophic monarch, and, in the prosecution of a just defense, Marcus and his generals obtained many signal victories, both on the Euphrates and on the Danube. The military establishment of the Roman Empire, which thus assured either its tranquility or success, will now become the proper and important object of our attention. Dion, LLXXI. Hist. August in Marco. The Parthian victories gave birth to a crowd of contemptible historians, whose memory has been rescued from oblivion and exposed to ridicule in a very lively piece of criticism of Lucian. In the purer ages of the Commonwealth, the use of arms was reserved for those ranks of citizens who had a country to love, a property to defend, and some share in enacting those laws, which it was their interest as well as duty to maintain. But in proportion as the public freedom was lost in extent of conquest, war was gradually improved into an art and degraded into a trade. The legions themselves, even at the time when they were recruited in the most distant provinces, were supposed to consist of Roman citizens. That distinction was generally considered either as a legal qualification or as a proper recompense for the soldier, but a more serious regard was paid to the essential merit of age, strength, and military stature. In all levies, a just preference was given to the climates of the north over those of the south. The race of men born to the exercise of arms was sought for in the country rather than in cities, and it was very reasonably presumed that the hardy occupations of smiths, carpenters, and huntsmen would supply more vigor and resolution than the sedentary trades which are employed in the service of luxury. After every qualification of property had been laid aside, the armies of the Roman emperors were still commanded, for the most part, by officers of liberal birth and education, but the common soldiers, like the mercenary troops of modern Europe, were drawn from the meanest and very frequently from the most profligate of mankind. The poorest rank of soldiers possessed above £40 sterling, Dionys, Halicon, Ive, 17, a very high qualification at a time when money was so scarce that an ounce of silver was equivalent to 70 pounds weight of brass. The populace, excluded by the ancient constitution, were indiscriminately admitted by Marius, see Sallust, de Bell, Jugurth, c. 91. Note on the uncertainty of all these estimates and the difficulty of fixing the relative value of brass and silver, compare Niebuhr, Vol. IP 473, Ansia Gay Trans, p. 452. According to Niebuhr, the relative disproportion in value between the two metals arose in a great degree from the abundance of brass or copper. M. Compare also Dureau de la Malle, Économie politique des Romains, especially LLL, M. 1845. Caesar formed his legion a lauda of Gauls and strangers, but it was during the license of civil war, and after the victory he gave them the freedom of the city for their reward. That public virtue which among the ancients was denominated patriotism is derived from a strong sense of our own interest in the preservation and prosperity of the free government of which we are members. Such a sentiment, which had rendered the legions of the Republic almost invincible, could make but a very feeble impression on the mercenary servants of a despotic prince, and it became necessary to supply that defect by other motives of a different but not less forcible nature, honor and religion. The peasant or mechanic imbibed the useful prejudice that he was advanced to the more dignified profession of arms, in which his rank and reputation would depend on his own valor, and that, although the prowess of a private soldier must often escape the notice of fame, his own behavior might sometimes confer glory or disgrace on the company, the legion, or even the army to whose honors he was associated. On his first entrance into the service, an oath was administered to him with every circumstance of solemnity. He promised never to desert his standard, to submit his own will to the commands of his leaders, and to sacrifice his life for the safety of the emperor and the empire. The attachment of the Roman troops to their standards was inspired by the united influence of religion and of honor. The golden eagle which glittered in the front of the legion was the object of their fondest devotion, nor was it esteemed less impious than it was ignominious to abandon that sacred ensign in the hour of danger. These motives, which derived their strength from the imagination, were enforced by fears and hopes of a more substantial kind. Regular pay, occasional donatives, and a stated recompense after the appointed time of service alleviated the hardships of the military life, whilst on the other hand it was impossible for cowardice or disobedience to escape the severest punishment. The centurions were authorized to chastise with blows. The generals had a right to punish with death, and it was an inflexible maxim of Roman discipline that a good soldier should dread his officers far more than the enemy. From such laudable arts did the valor of the imperial troops receive a degree of firmness and docility unattainable by the impetuous and irregular passions of barbarians. Tacitus calls the Roman eagles bellorum deos. They were placed in a chapel in the camp, and with the other deities received the religious worship of the troops, 20 smonths. Note, see also Dio. Cass, XL, C. 18, M. The Sigronovius de Pecunia Vetere, LIII, P120 and C. The Emperor Domitian raised the annual stipend of the legionaries to 12 pieces of gold, which, in his time, was equivalent to about 10 of our guineas. This pay, somewhat higher than our own, had been, and was afterwards, gradually increased according to the progress of wealth and military government. After 20 years' service, the veteran received 3,000 denarii, about £100 sterling, or a proportionable allowance of land. The pay and advantages of the guards were, in general, about double those of the legions, and yet so sensible were the Romans of the imperfection of valor without skill and practice that, in their language, the name of an army was borrowed from a word which signified exercise. 36 military exercises were the important and unremitted object of their discipline. The recruits and young soldiers were constantly trained, both in the morning and in the evening. Nor was age or knowledge allowed to excuse the veterans from the daily repetition of what they had completely learnt. Large sheds were erected in the winter quarters of the troops, that their useful labours might not receive any interruption from the most tempestuous weather, and it was carefully observed that the arms destined to this imitation of war should be of double the weight which was required in real action. It is not the purpose of this work to enter into any minute description of the Roman exercises. We shall only remark that they comprehended whatever could add strength to the body, activity to the limbs, or grace to the motions. The soldiers were diligently instructed to march, to run, to leap, to swim, to carry heavy burdens, to handle every species of arms that was used either for offense or for defense, either in distant engagement or in a closer onset, to form a variety of evolutions, and to move to the sound of flutes in the Pyrrhic or martial dance. In the midst of peace, the Roman troops familiarized themselves with the practice of war, and it is prettily remarked by an ancient historian who had fought against them, that the effusion of blood was the only circumstance which distinguished field of battle, from a field of exercise. It was the policy of the ablest generals and even of the emperors themselves to encourage these military studies by their presence and example, and we are informed that Hadrian, as well as Trajan, frequently condescended to instruct unexperienced soldiers, to reward the diligent, and sometimes to dispute with them the prize of superior strength or dexterity. Under the reigns of those princes, the science of tactics was cultivated with success, and as long as the empire retained any vigor, their military instructions were respected as the most perfect model of Roman discipline. Te exercitus ab exercitando varo de lingua latina LEV. Cicero in Tusculan, LII, 37:15. There is room for a very interesting work, which should lay open the connection between the languages and manners of nations. Note: I am not aware of the existence at present of such a work, but the profound observations of the late William von Humboldt in the introduction to his posthumously published essay on the language of the island of Java, Über die Kawi-Sprache, Berlin, 1836, may cause regret that this task was not completed by that accomplished and universal scholar. M. Square. The Pyrrhic dance is extremely well illustrated by M. Square in the Académie des Inscriptions, Tom. XXX Bur, p. 262, and c. That learned academician, in a series of memoirs, has collected all the passages of the ancients that relate to the Roman legion. 9 centuries of war had gradually introduced into the service many alterations and improvements. The legions, as they are described by Polybius in the time of the Punic Wars, differed very materially from those which achieved the victories of Caesar, or defended the monarchy of Hadrian and the Antonines. The constitution of the imperial legion may be described in a few words. The heavy armed infantry, which composed its principal strength, was divided into 10 cohorts and 55 companies under the orders of a correspondent number of tribunes and centurions. The first cohort, which always claimed the post of honor and the custody of the eagle, was formed of 1,105 soldiers, the most approved for valor and fidelity. The remaining 9 cohorts consisted each of 555, and the whole body of legionary infantry amounted to 6,100 men. Their arms were uniform and admirably adapted to the nature of their service: an open helmet with a lofty crest, a breastplate or coat of mail, greaves on their legs, and an ample buckler on their left arm. The buckler was of an oblong and concave figure, 4 feet in length and 2.5 in breadth, framed of a light wood, covered with a bull's hide, and strongly guarded with plates of brass. Besides a lighter spear, the legionary soldier grasped in his right hand the formidable pilum, a ponderous javelin whose utmost length was about 6 feet, and which was terminated by a massy triangular point of steel of 18 inches. This instrument was indeed much inferior to our modern firearms, since it was exhausted by a single discharge, at the distance of only 10 or 12 paces. Yet when it was launched by a firm and skillful hand, there was not any cavalry that durst venture within its reach, nor any shield or corselet that could sustain the impetuosity of its weight. As soon as the Roman had darted his pilum, he drew his sword and rushed forwards to close with the enemy. His sword was a short, well-tempered Spanish blade that carried a double edge and was alike suited to the purpose of striking or of pushing, but the soldier was always instructed to prefer the latter use of his weapon, as his own body remained less exposed, whilst he inflicted a more dangerous wound on his adversary. The legion was usually drawn up 8 deep, and the regular distance of 3 feet was left between the files as well as ranks. A body of troops habituated to preserve this open order, in a long front and a rapid charge, found themselves prepared to execute every disposition which the circumstances of war or the skill of their leader might suggest. The soldier possessed a free space for his arms and motions, and sufficient intervals were allowed, through which seasonable reinforcements might be introduced to the relief of the exhausted combatants. The tactics of the Greeks and Macedonians were formed on very different principles. The strength of the phalanx depended on 16 ranks of long pikes wedged together in the closest array. But it was soon discovered by reflection, as well as by the event, that the strength of the phalanx was unable to contend with the activity of the legion. Vegetius de Re Militari, L2C1. In the purer age of Caesar and Cicero, the word miles was almost confined to the infantry. Under the Lower Empire and the times of chivalry, it was appropriated almost as exclusively to the men-at-arms, who fought on horseback. In the time of Polybius and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, LVCC, the steel point of the pilum seems to have been much longer. In the time of Vegetius, it was reduced to a foot, or even 9 inches. I have chosen a medium. See Arrian's Tactics. With the true partiality of a Greek, Arrian rather chose to describe the phalanx, of which he had read, than the legions which he had commanded. The cavalry, without which the force of the legion would have remained imperfect, was divided into 10 troops or squadrons. The first, as the companion of the first cohort, consisted of 132 men, whilst each of the other 9 amounted only to 66. The entire establishment formed a regiment, if we may use the modern expression, of 726 horse, naturally connected with its respective legion, but occasionally separated to act in the line and to compose a part of the wings of the army. The cavalry of the emperors was no longer composed, like that of the ancient republic, of the noblest youths of Rome and Italy, who, by performing their military service on horseback, prepared themselves for the offices of senator and consul, and solicited by deeds of valor the future suffrages of their countrymen. Since the alteration of manners and government, the most wealthy of the equestrian order were engaged in the administration of justice and of the revenue, and whenever they embraced the profession of arms, they were immediately entrusted with a troop of horse or a cohort of foot. Trajan and Hadrian formed their cavalry from the same provinces and the same class of their subjects, which recruited the ranks of the legion. The horses were bred, for the most part, in Spain or Cappadocia. The Roman troopers despised the complete armor with which the cavalry of the East was encumbered. Their more useful arms consisted in a helmet, an oblong shield, light boots, and a coat of mail. A javelin and a long broad sword were their principal weapons of offense. The use of lances and of iron maces they seem to have borrowed from the barbarians. Vegedi Militari L2C. His positive testimony, which might be supported by circumstantial evidence, ought surely to silence those critics who refuse the Imperial Legion its proper body of cavalry. Note, see also Joseph. The true sense of that very curious passage was first discovered and illustrated by M. de Beaufort, République Romaine, L2C 2M, as in the instance of Horace and Agricola. This appears to have been a defect in the Roman discipline, which Hadrian endeavored to remedy by ascertaining the legal age of a tribune. Note, these details are not altogether accurate. Although in the latter days of the Republic and under the first emperors the young Roman nobles obtained the command of a squadron or a cohort with greater facility than in the former times, they never obtained it without passing through a tolerably long military service. Usually they served first in the Praetorian cohort, which was entrusted with the guard of the general. They were received into the companionship contubernium of some superior officer, and were there formed for duty. Thus Julius Caesar, though sprung from a great family, served first as contubernalis under the praetor, M. Thermus, and later under Servilius the Isaurian. The example of Horace, which Gibbon adduces to prove that young knights were made tribunes immediately on entering the service, proves nothing. In the first place, Horace was not a knight. He was the son of a freedman of Venusia in Apulia, who exercised the humble office of coactor exauctionum, collector of payments at auctions. Sat. I. Vi. 45 or 86. Moreover, when the poet was made tribune, Brutus, whose army was nearly entirely composed of Orientals, gave this title to all the Romans of consideration who joined him. The emperors were still less difficult in their choice. The number of tribunes was augmented, the title and honors were conferred on persons whom they wished to attack to the court. Augustus conferred on the sons of senators, sometimes the tribunate, sometimes the command of a squadron. Claudius gave to the knights who entered into the service, first the command of a cohort of auxiliaries, later that of a squadron, and at length, for the first time, the tribunate. Sweat in cloud, with the notes of Ernesti, the abuses that arose caused by the edict of Hadrian, which fixed the age at which that honor could be attained. This edict was subsequently obeyed, for the Emperor Valerian, in a letter addressed to Mulvius Gallienus, Praetorian Prefect, excuses himself for having violated it in favor of the young Probus, afterwards emperor, on whom he had conferred the tribunate at an earlier age on account of his rare talents. Vopisc, in Prob, though already invested with the title of tribune, was contubernalis in Britain with Suetonius Paulinus, Tachy, Agier. 5. M. The safety and honor of the empire was principally entrusted to the legions, but the policy of Rome condescended to adopt every useful instrument of war. Considerable levies were regularly made among the provincials, who had not yet deserved the honorable distinction of Romans. Many dependent princes and communities dispersed round the frontiers were permitted for a while to hold their freedom and security by the tenure of military service. 55. Even select troops of hostile barbarians were frequently compelled or persuaded to consume their dangerous valor in remote climates, and for the benefit of the state. All these were included under the general name of auxiliaries, and howsoever they might vary according to the difference of times and circumstances, their numbers were seldom much inferior to those of the legions themselves. Among the auxiliaries, the bravest and most faithful bands were placed under the command of prefects and centurions, and severely trained in the arts of Roman discipline, but the far greater part retained those arms to which the nature of their country, or their early habits of life, more peculiarly adapted them. By this institution, each legion, to whom a certain proportion of auxiliaries was allotted, contained within itself every species of lighter troops and of missile weapons, and was capable of encountering every nation, with the advantages of its respective arms and discipline. Nor was the legion destitute of what in modern language would be styled a train of artillery. It consisted in 10 military engines of the largest, and 55 of a smaller size, but all of which, either in an oblique or horizontal manner, discharged stones and darts with irresistible violence. Marcus Antoninus obliged the vanquished Squadi and Marcomanni to supply him with a large body of troops, which he immediately sent into Britain. Dion Cassius. Those who fix a regular proportion of as many foot and twice as many horse confound the auxiliaries of the emperors with the Italian allies of the Republic. Chevalier Follard, Polybe, Tom, IIP 233-90. He prefers them in many respects to our modern cannon and mortars. We may observe that the use of them in the field gradually became more prevalent in proportion as personal valor and military skill declined with the Roman Empire. When men were no longer found, their place was supplied by machines. See Vegetius, EI.